more optimistic camp that recognizes that there will be new jobs created and new opportunities created as technology and automation reach around the world. But the gap that we identified is that there's really nowhere for policymakers to turn for actionable solutions at this point. So what we decided to do was to compare a case study in Europe, Germany, and the United States. Germany and the United States are both highly advanced economies with relatively highly skilled workers, and both places are struggling to understand the effect that automation, for example, robotics, and then technology, things like machine learning and artificial intelligence are having on their economies and jobs. And so I was thrilled when we got the invitation to participate in this webinar, because I think that there is actually a lot that can be learned from international dialogue on this topic. So far, we found that the conversations have been siloed and have taken place within individual countries. And with Philippe, we've unlocked all of this really interesting information that can happen when we start comparing different countries. So with that, I'm going to talk very, very briefly about the situation concerning digitization and the future of work in the United States. So the future of work in the US and the policy conversation here is marked by a massive paradox. The paradox is that since the early 1960s, we've been undergoing a long-term transition from jobs in manufacturing to service sector positions. So in 1960, 1 in 4 American workers was employed in manufacturing. Today, in 2017, that's actually 1 in 10. So where have all these people who have transitioned from manufacturing found employment? Well, it's been in the service sector. And the service sector could be in anything from fast food positions to coding, knowledge-intensive positions like coding. So today in 2017, there are 102 million American workers that are working in the service sector. And we have an unemployment rate here in the United States of 4.2%. I think that when we released our paper, it was actually 4.5% in the United States, and so it's decreasing. So on its face, the economic situation here in the United States is very good. Basically, everyone who wants a job can find a job. However, the massive paradox that we're seeing is that there's wage and skills bifurcation that's occurring within the American economy. And this is also referred to as job polarization. So the automation of routine tasks, whether it's in manufacturing or in the service sector, is leading to the creation of many, many low-wage, low-skill positions. And then on the other end of the spectrum is leading to high-wage, high-skill positions. So the middle of our labor market is coming under pressure from technology and automation. So what we found in our paper is that although the policy conversation is concerned around the elimination of jobs, what might really be happening is that automation and technology are having more of an effect on wages and then the number of full-time jobs available. So whereas before, if you were working in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Florida and you were working 40 hours a week or 45 hours a week, now you might only be able to find 25 hours a week or 30 hours a week at the position that you have. And so in our paper, we use the case study of retail as an example for the changes that the service sector is undergoing. In the United States, we have roughly 10% of our workforce employed in retail. So that's either directly employed in retail or supported by the retail industry in some way, for example, in warehousing. However, since October of 2016, we've lost roughly 100,000 retail positions in the United States. And many of these people that have lost their jobs in retail, so working in a grocery store or in a small business, have actually been displaced to, for example, Amazon warehouses or other logistics centers run by e-retailers. However, in our paper, we point out that these new jobs with people working in warehouses are also very, very highly subject to automation, because that's where robotics and technology will impact the most, because these are very, very highly automatable environments where you can control the lighting, you can control the space between the shelves, and so these are the places where we'll see the introduction of robotics in the coming years. So who and what is driving the digital transition in the United States, and what are some of the trends and patterns? Well, under the Obama administration, there was a focus on advanced manufacturing, which is also known as Industry 4.0, and using these technologies as a way to drive employment in manufacturing. However, under the Obama administration, there was also sort of a recognition that the service sector was a driver of job creation and innovation in the United States. And so there was also a very, very strong focus on upgrading everyone's education and skills. And so a lot of this focus was actually on increasing the number of American workers either obtaining an associate's degree, which is a 2-year degree, or a full 4-year degree. However, there's since been a shift since January 2017, where the Trump administration is focusing much more on apprenticeship and especially creating partnerships with companies as a way of fostering apprenticeship in the United States. And so this is actually an example of where the Trump administration has taken a lead from Germany and case studies from Germany and is trying to implement those throughout the United States. And another trend that we see under the Trump administration is that there are states, counties, and cities that are taking an increasing initiative for developing policy around digitization and then the future of work. And I know that my co-author, Philippe, will talk more about how in Germany, the federal government has led a lot of the dialogue. That's not necessarily what we're seeing in the United States. It's much more diffuse, and there are policy solutions that are coming from the local level and then foundations and think tanks. And so what is noteworthy about the United States and its next technological transition? Well, I think that the United States has been a first adopter of many technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence and machine learning or automation. So many of the people participating in this webinar, the United States might be an interesting case study because it can be used as a bellwether for how technology and automation will disrupt not only jobs, but wages and then the skills that are needed to succeed in the 21st century. The United States is also a noteworthy case study because there are many examples of bottom-up policy solutions that are coming from our cities and our states. And then what are so I've been asked to respond to this question on the #1 digital risk that policymakers should pay attention to today. And we think that it's really the effect of automation and technology on the service sector. And as I mentioned previously, it might not be the number of jobs created or destroyed, but policymakers should pay more attention to the wages that are associated with the new jobs created, and then any inequality that comes from these new positions as well, and the bifurcation of our labor market between high-wage, high-skill positions and low-wage, low-skill positions. And then we'd also like to have more of a focus on the social and political costs that come from squeezed jobs and wages in the United States. And so how can we remove barriers to the adoption of new technologies and at the same time reduce inequality? We think that it begins with starting a dialogue in the United States on the future of work. And what we realized over the course of writing this paper and of doing convenings in Germany and the United States is that there's a huge need, not only among policymakers, but of average citizens to learn more about how technology and automation are changing jobs, wages, and skills. And we also realized that we need to have more of a people-centric approach to how we're developing policy around technology and the future of work. And very, very briefly before I hand it off to my co-author, Philippe, who are the winners and the losers of technological innovation in the United States? Well, the winners would be workers that are working in high-skill, high-wage positions and who have the soft skills in order to become more adaptable and flexible to change. More winners might be regions that have domain expertise in some skill set. For example, Washington, D.C. and the tech sector that's focused around defense technologies. And so if you're one of these cities like San Francisco, Boston, or New York that has a strong ecosystem of universities and tech startups, then you're really able to double down on that and to attract workers. who are the losers? Well, that would be low-wage, low-skill workers in the service sector that really lack skills that are durable to technology and automation. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague Philippe, who will present our case study on Germany and to talk about that more in depth.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jeffrey. And before I hand over to Philippe, just a reminder for all participants, if there would be already questions that you have on Jeffrey's reflections, feel free to enter them in the chat box and just direct your message to everyone. I will get back to the questions when we start the initial round. So having said that, I'll hand over now to Philippe. Philippe, over to you.
Thank you very much, and hello from Berlin. And thanks to my co-author, Jeff. As in this webinar, the discussion in Germany tends to follow the American-led discussion. So I give you a bit more of context for the German on the German debate on the future of work. So when Frey and Osborne in 2013 published a paper on the effects of automation in the U.S. labor market, this led to some turmoil amongst policy makers here in Germany that's concentrated on labor markets. So the Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, as a response, mandated a study that should look into the effects of automation on the German workforce. And in the U.S., we talked about 47% of automation risk. In Germany, these numbers were reduced by far to around 12%. Other studies came to the same conclusion, where results published of 15% of automation risk, because we had a look into a more task-related approach, because the understanding in Germany, so far as it goes, that specific tasks form a job profile, and not each and every task that is automated will lead to the vanishing of the job profile, but there are different tasks that will come to accomplish a new job profile. So this created a great deal of relief amongst policymakers, and in 2016, the IAB, that's an academic service of Germany's Federal Employment Agency, published a scenario study with a focus year of around 2030, and it found that roughly 1.5 million jobs will be destroyed by automation, and at the same time 1.5 million jobs will also be created due to technological change. So the general debate in Germany is quite positive when it comes to potential risks of technological disruption. And the main finding was that jobs will change within and across economic sectors, and the workforce will be under enormous pressure, but in total there won't be any reduced amounts of labor. So to give you a summary, the debate in Germany, as I mentioned, is overall positive. The workforce is perceived fit enough to adopt to technological change due to advanced college education and strong VET programs that are perceived to adjust well to changing demands of the labor market. And then the German debate is strongly biased towards the transformation of the manufacturing sector. And this is quite interesting because it employs roughly 25% of the German workforce. So it has a very strong economic output. That's why the economic policy is very much centered on the export-oriented German industry sector, which is also comprising, as you may have heard, the strong German Mittelstand, which comprises small and medium-sized enterprises. So the aim is to ensure a future-proof German manufacturing sector based on interconnected cyber-physical systems under the term of Industry 4.0. This is the dominant policy aim, to be able to future-proof this manufacturing sector. So there's also hope to being able to create a high-performance service sector around this very strong high-tech manufacturing sector that specializes on so-called industry services. So services provided to the strong manufacturing sector, such as, for instance, big data analytics or smart robotics. Due to this strong focus on the manufacturing sector, labor market effects in the service sector are therefore widely underestimated or simply overlooked by policymakers and in the general debate as well. So the lack of understanding the potential impact of automation technologies coming from artificial intelligence, for instance, is very obvious in Germany. So trade union representation, for instance, in the service sector is by far less effective as in the manufacturing sector. So that my contribution to the shared paper that I've written with Jeff was to hint at this lack of knowledge of what are the dynamics in this sector. So when it comes to policy responses, we see that there are large government funding and grants for research on advanced manufacturing under the umbrella term of Industry 4.0. Especially by the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy and the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. Also, the federal government has instituted a so-called high-tech strategy that is also aiming to future-proof a strong German manufacturing sector. And other initiatives comprise the Platform Industry 4.0, which seeks to connect the Mittelstand that is lacking to adopt technologies related to advanced manufacturing. So there are institutions that counsel the Mittelstand on adopting new technologies to empower it in a way. And there was the dialogue process of the Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, which was structured into a green book and a white book. So the Federal Ministry established a dialogue with civil society, with academia, with businesses, and trade unions on the changing nature of work due to technological change. So the Green Book, over a period of roughly 1 year, stated questions about how work will change in Germany, and the White Book tried to give answers to the demand of this technological shift. But to be honest, there are no concrete policy actions with regards to future challenges that are coming out from this dialogue process. So the Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs tried to widen the view from not only manufacturing but also to the service sector, but it lacks some concrete policy solutions to the effects created by labor market polarization or automation. So what has been discussed so far in this debate are so-called Experimentierräume. So these provide specific solutions to businesses to move away from specific legislation, for instance, to issue more flexible working hours to their workforces. So in essence, in these experimental stages, firms can differ or can move away from existing legislation, experiment with new frameworks of work. And there's also been pushed forward this idea of a personal account, where each adult is given a specific amount of money by the start of his or her professional career. And this money then can be used, for instance, for a sabbatical, for adult education, or for starting a company. But this has not yet been pushed into action. I think this is a French model that Germany tries to follow there. So no concrete policy actions with regards to labor market disruption or technological change. So this brings me to a small criticism that the development in the service sector, whereby far more people in Germany as well work, almost 75% of the workforce, are not on the agenda of policymakers. And there's a very, very positive notion on the potential threats of automation technology. And the OECD Employment Outlook, for instance, in 2017, clearly states that there is an existing labor market polarization in Germany, but this is neglected or negated in academia or by policymakers. So labor market polarization is not seen as a problem in Germany. And Germany lacks a monitoring of how tasks within job profiles change, such as skills forecasting tool should be created to inform policy decisions, especially if you want to future-proof VET programs or institute lifelong learning. So this over-focusing on the service sector has led Jeff and I to co-author a paper which you could as well download on our respective web pages. And this is a short framework, an introduction to the debate in Germany from my end. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Philip, for your introduction and reflection. Definitely we will use or upload that paper also on our massive online open course for further debate and conversation. Already some questions are coming in through our chat function. I'm just taking note of them. Feel free to continue to add questions there so that after Jonathan's input we can go into interactive conversation. So we started in Washington, we moved towards Berlin, and now we are flying to somewhere, if I'm not mistaken, it should be Accra. Jonathan, are you out there?
Hi. Yeah, I'm not in there. I'm actually in Nicaragua at the moment, in Managua, okay. Capital of Nicaragua in Central America. Yeah. Okay. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you very clear.
Okay, great. So the bandwidth here isn't great, and maybe that's a good introduction as to what I'm going to talk about today. So at Practical Action, we talk about something that we have coined as a term as technology justice. So what we really mean by technology justice is looking at the social justice aspects of the technology trends and changes that we are experiencing in the world right now, and also the notion that technology is a fundamental tool for underpinning a basic standard of a dignified life and decent work. Yet those technologies are not available still to the vast majority of people around the world. So while we may talk about the impacts of higher-end technologies such as artificial intelligence and robotics and automation, as Jeffrey and Philippe have covered across the US and German economies, actually it's access to even some of the most basic technologies which we think will be the most disruptive, both positively and negatively, for the lives and work opportunities of people in developing contexts instead. So when we talk about technology justice, we mean four aspects in total. The first is access to those technologies which can help people to live a basic standard of living, whether that's energy, water, sanitation, or other key aspects. The second is around sustainability, so trying to ensure that the technologies that we are using are sustainable, not just now, but also so that they don't have a negative impact on other people in the future or in surrounding areas as well. And I'll come on to that a little bit later. The third is around innovation, and really trying to look and analyze what is the purpose and direction of innovation, of technological innovation that we're experiencing in the world, and how are different types of people actually being involved in that innovation. Right now it feels like in the world we have quite a Western, Northern Hemisphere-centric type of innovation that's mostly coming out of Silicon Valley and other highly developed technology areas. Yet we know that there are thousands and possibly millions of smaller scale frugal innovations that are taking place elsewhere in the world. So how do we find those? How do we elevate those to have greater impact? And the fourth there is empowerment. So again, it's coming back to this notion of what is the purpose of technological change. How can we ensure that the technological change that we're experiencing in the world is actually empowering people rather than disempowering them as well? So we always have winners and losers, as both Jeffrey and Philippe have talked about there, from technological change. We hope that technological change overall, over time, will create more positive trends. But regardless, along the way, there will be winners and losers, whether that's at a firm level or indeed, as we're maybe experiencing now, across a much wider spectrum of people in the economy. But the work that we have done at Practical Action and with other partners is really highlighted. In terms of who wins and who loses, it comes down to who has the capacities, the skills, the resources, the assets needed to respond and change to those changing technologies, who is able to take that risk, who has the capacity to take that risk, who has the assets to actually be innovative and take that leap forward. If you are someone that is in an extremely poor situation with very few assets, very little infrastructure, you may not simply have the ability to be that experimental, to take that risk if your livelihood is in a fragile situation. So, as I mentioned, right now I'm in Managua. So I wanted to, in Nicaragua. It's a Central American country. It's the second poorest country in the entire Western Hemisphere after only Haiti. So what will be disruptive in locations like this? Well, probably the most positively disruptive aspects will be the ones that can address just the most basic aspects of living a dignified life and securing decent work. It's morning time here for me, and I imagine when it was morning time for the rest of you across the world in this webinar, you probably got up and took a shower. I can't do that here in Managua. I'm in a fairly nice area of the city. However, there is no water here until 5 p.m. each day. This is a basic technology that even the Romans were able to capture, yet here in places like Managua, that doesn't exist. We don't have equal access to water. The access isn't distributed fairly across the city. But equally, if we look at where money was spent on investments for water access last year, globally across the world, just 25% was spent on trying to address water access in places like this, places that don't have decent, consistent, safe running water. And then if we look at the technological innovation side of that, less than 1% of the world's expenditure on water and sanitation access was actually spent on innovating and undertaking research and development into new water and sanitation technologies. Yet this is a problem that faces all of us around the world. So if we want economies to progress, to develop, and to continue to experience positive disruption from technological change, we need to think about what are the basic conditions that can underpin a technological revolution. And for me, those are some of the most basic aspects of life, whether it be water, food, or even electricity. Again, electricity is a problem that, while it isn't such a problem here in Managua, in many places around the world is a fundamental aspect for all these other technologies that we've talked about to be able to operate. Still in the world, we have 1.1 billion people that don't have any access to electricity whatsoever, and a further 2.1 billion, so that's roughly half the world. Again, if you add those together, those 2.2 billion have what's considered substandard access to electricity, what we call Tier 3 access. Now, Tier 3 access still isn't that great. That's still only a minimum of 3 hours of energy per day and enough to power a couple of small appliances. So when we think about how technology is going to impact us in different areas of the world, we need to think about what are the conditions to enable that technology to take hold. And for me, things like water and energy access will be fundamental to that. And yet again, we know the technologies are out there to help us to be able to do that, but access to those is unequal. There's an inequity in the access to those technologies. That's what we call technology injustice. And we've already highlighted around the world, the World Bank, the UN, the World Energy Outlook and others have already highlighted that distributed renewable energy technologies are the key to ensuring that the vast majority of the population have access to those types of technologies. Yet still, just 3% of all investments made into energy in 2016 to 2017 fiscal year, just 3% was on research and innovation into distributed renewable energy technologies. So this, for me, is about where we can have policy responses to change this situation, to enable some of those other digital technologies that we're talking about that rely upon a secure, stable energy supply, that rely often upon a secure and stable internet connection as well. Where can policy responses help us to address these situations? Well, for me, and for Practical Action, and from our research, it shows that it comes down to the incentives that we place on research and development and innovation in technology in different ways. At what points in the innovation cycle are funds, whether they be public or private, actually going to supporting these technologies? Are we looking still at the commercial value rather than the wider social and economic impact that can be achieved through other types of technology. We have an enormous market out there, truly enormous. We talk often about the bottom billion, that being the 1 billion people who are living still in extreme poverty, less than $1.90 per day. And yet there's still a further 2.5 billion that live on less than $5 a day as well. So in reality, we're talking about a bottom 3.5 billion people in this global economy, all of which, or the majority of which, are in precarious, fragile, and informal work. So when we talk about the impacts of technological change on workers, I know Jeffrey and Philippe have talked there about the polarization, the bipolarization of the work economy, pushing jobs into higher end, higher skilled, higher paid, but much fewer jobs, but pushing many others further down into lower skilled, lower paid work, and often with lower hours as well. But that is mostly within the formal economy. If we look at the further sort of ripple impacts of those changes onto the informal economy, those people who have no secure work contracts at all, who are living sort of hand to hand, hand to mouth every single day in urban areas, in rural areas, whether they be waste pickers, whether they be farmers, or whether they be water vendors, the impacts that they're experiencing are fundamentally different. And the drivers for how they seek work are fundamentally different as well. So we need to ensure that policy responses are also supporting those informal workers and not just the changes experienced by those in informal employment as well. I've seen this year in a number of different reports and resources and on webinars and MOOCs around the world that I've participated in, a stat that's been quoted that was released by The Economist at the end of last year, that 85% of Ethiopia's jobs are at threat from automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence. So when we talk about the 25% of people being impacted in Germany from in the manufacturing sector from that, the economists are claiming that 85% of Ethiopia's jobs are at threat. But really it's a bit of a misnomer, because actually less than 20% of the workforce in Ethiopia are in formal work, to which this stat is talking about. Therefore, actually, there's roughly 85% of the country to which there has been literally no study, no investigation, no research, and no data upon the impact of technological trends and changes for them. And most of those are in agriculture as well. So what can be done, and what are the technological changes that can have an impact in those different areas? What can be positively disruptive for this bottom 3.5 billion in the global economy? Well, in practical action, we have a number of examples that I can talk about that are starting to have a real positive impact. When we talk about energy access, the majority of people that will be connected to new energy sources in the next 15 years will be through solar power, whether that be small-scale household solar power, or whether it's through a microgrid or a nanogrid in small communities. And the digital payment systems that are now emerging in places like Kenya, in Ghana, in Senegal, in South Africa, are revolutionizing that industry. So the digital technologies that we're using in different ways in developed countries are being harnessed in extremely innovative ways in developing contexts as well. So people using mobile phones to make micropayments to pay for their energy use and to pay for the capital cost of solar technologies. But what's happening now is we're seeing even more advanced innovation into those types of payments and those systems. We're now seeing the prevalence of blockchain technologies being used for those solar payment systems, and particularly when they're in a networked grid situation. We're seeing blockchain being used for peer-to-peer networked power. So if you can imagine, you're in a small village in Bangladesh, and there are, say, 50 houses, 30 of which currently have small-scale solar home systems to power their house. But that means there's 20 people that are slightly poorer still and can't afford even those micropayments for the solar home systems and the power that they're generating. Well, the peer-to-peer technology enables now those different producers of energy at a household level to sell and to distribute their energy to those that don't have their own solar home system during hours in which they're not using them to their full capacity. And through that blockchain peer-to-peer technology, they're able to trace and track exactly where the energy has come from, and using that ledger technology, ensure that payments are made through mobile technology between those households. So we're creating new, smaller scale economies of energy, which are going to be totally transformative, we believe, as that technology spreads around the world. We're also seeing the use of mobile phones for organizing as well. So when we talk about the capacities that people have to respond to change, to harness the positive impacts of technological change, and to mitigate the negative impacts of it, organizing as a group, as a cooperative, as a union, as a unified voice among informal workers is extremely important. And we're seeing from places in Peru to South Africa to India to Kenya and beyond, in Zimbabwe and in Sudan as well, in very remote places, we're seeing mobile phones being used as a way to spread information, to spread knowledge, to communicate and to organize. And when people are better able to organize and to bargain and to fight for their own rights and to fight for their position within that value chain, we're seeing much better uptake of those technologies. It also means that people are able to collectively invest in those technologies as well. So if you are extremely resource poor and an informal worker, it's highly unlikely you will have the means yourself to invest in whatever new technology it may be, whether it be a new sewing machine that is slightly automated to create newer garments, whether it be a new construction tool that you might use if you are a construction worker. It's highly unlikely you have the means to do that yourself. So the organizing, often done through digital platforms and technologies, can be really transformative for those people. We're also seeing it as a tool for greater accountability, and this links back again to the policy responses that can be made. In Kenya, we have seen in the capital of Nairobi the pioneering use of a new technology called MagiVoice. MagiVoice enables consumers of the city's water to log any problems they may have using a very basic, simple SMS-based system. They're able to log that complaint, log the location, and log the exact issue that they're facing. What they're then able to do is receive automatically back a reference number, which they can then use to hold to account the city water company. It also means that the city water company are more able to rapidly hire a local, informal water service vendor or water service engineer to go and deal with the problem. They're also able to send out automated alerts to all the known water vendors in that area to know that they then have a hotspot for where they can provide water in the interim period until the problem is fixed. We're also seeing it used as a means for information. As I mentioned, the majority of informal workers around the world are in the agricultural sector, but these are most vulnerable to the changes that we're experiencing in the environment, both through climate change and through existing sort of natural hazards that they're facing, whether it be floods, droughts, cyclones, or other issues. And through early warning systems, gathering data using big data analytics across a whole range of things from meteorological observations to very small scale river sensors, we're able to aggregate all that information and then provide that data to farmers, to villagers, to middlemen, to milk vendors, whoever it may be, to notify them of the oncoming hazard that they may be facing so that they can then take appropriate action. So while there are many potential hazards facing the world's bottom 3.5 billion people, those that are in informal work that don't have the means and capacities to adapt, in which technological change is being experienced in fundamentally different ways. There are also many positives out there, but what we need to do is ensure, just as Jeffrey and Philippe said, really, about that the skills that we're offering, the training opportunities, the work opportunities, and things like the personal accounts that you talked about there, Philippe, from Germany and France, could all be extremely useful policy solutions in these areas. But I do think that the world needs to think beyond mobile and digital technologies when we talk about the future of work, and think beyond just robotics, artificial intelligence, and automation, and actually think about what is the purpose of our innovation trajectory that we are on right now as a global economy and as a global humanity. What is the purpose of that, and how can it actually best meet the most basic fundamental needs of human life: water, shelter, food, power? If we can crack those first, we will have a much better, much more equitable platform to ensure that these other technologies can be positively disruptive in all economies around the world, and ensure that we have a growing global economy. So when we talk about policy solutions, I will reiterate that I think it is around the incentives for innovation, ensuring that innovations that may have specific social good are funded through what we often refer to as the valley of death section of the innovation cycle, and looking beyond the immediate returns on investment to looking at the longer term potential of that enormous 3.5 billion person market that we see out there in the world. And coming on to the final question in a slightly more negative way, I guess, that I was asked to address, which was, what do I believe is the #1 digital risk that we're experiencing right now, or that we will experience in the world? And for me, and for Practical Action, and for many others in this space, we believe it's that, and as the World Bank in its digital dividends report last year also highlighted, it's the risk that the digitization of our economy, of our society, of all aspects of our lives will actually exacerbate inequalities rather than reduce them. What we're seeing at the moment is that although there are many positive examples, the general trend is that digitization is mirroring the existing inequalities in society. What we need to do is ensure that in the future, digital technologies, particularly in the domain of work and secure and decent work, is actually going to reduce those inequalities instead. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan, for your reflections. And with this, we had 3 inputs from Washington, Berlin, and also from Nicaragua. And also specifically opening up, let's say, the global conversation has been quite interesting here. One of the elements, and I will take some comments that I've received throughout the conversation, is very lined up with what Jonathan recently was mentioned, that a lot of the future of work debate is sometimes really narrowed down to, let's say, digitization, automatization, robotization, and the different dimensions that you bring now into the discussion are much reflecting a wider complexity out here, which makes the discussion also maybe a bit more richer, a bit more human. Your reflections on diving into the purpose of innovation connects very well with one of the thematic conversations the ILO is currently conducting, which is called Work and Society, the role of work in society. And there really almost, let's say, an existential reflection of what is the purpose of work anyhow. And that dives into a lot of different discussions than merely only the technological component. The second comment that is coming in is also interesting, and that was also clear by exposing the country where you're currently in the global digital divide. And we remain here of your reflections there, that it's more than just the digital divide. It might be the technological divide in all its aspects. But what is interesting, someone mentioning, is that although you focus on some of the technological limitations out there, some of the inequalities that are out there, you also focus on some opportunities by leapfrogging on technology that is completely not yet integrated even in Western economies, and there the blockchain example was a very good example for it. Before I will open or give back the floor to the three of you, there are also a lot of questions that came in through our chat box here, and I will pick some out, and then you can choose on the ones that you would like to enter. Kai from Montreal has said that on artificial intelligence is often said to be a transformational technology, but who benefits really from the AA technique? How can we ensure that the benefits of artificial intelligence are more broadly shared, and who could be excluded, and what could be the new forms of digital exclusion? Maybe also connecting with the remark of Jonathan, is the new kind of digital revolutions or technologies not only going to mirror the existing inequality, or has it also the capacity to include, so this inclusion and exclusion dimension? The question from Shazia Majid is, disruptive technologies are changing the work environments and the digital divide is increasing. Companies have no physical existence in a country and can do business there and earn profits without paying taxes. What would you say about that? We focus now on 3 countries, but indeed we're part of a global conversation where the regulations and mechanisms not necessarily are nation bound anymore. So maybe some reflections from the panel on that element. Padmini's question, I quickly repeat, although Philippe already gave some answers to it. And she would like to know what has been the impact of the e-retailing in Germany. Many unions like Verdi or Uniglobal Union has been posting against inhuman and deplorable working conditions in the warehouses of the e-retailing companies. And I'm interested in knowing whether there has been extensive research done in this sector. So let's move me to a question from Derek. And he says that the technology justice presentation is interesting on how the proposed interventions may interact with big organizations such as the World Trade Organization. I have in mind the case of India losing a case to manufacture a predetermined proportion of solar panels in India. Moving to the next question, how will these disruptive technologies impact the workers employed in German or American companies operating in emerging economies? So that was another question. Also take note that Kai, our collaborator, has been posting all the references through the research that was mentioned already on the chat box. We also will upload that on our platform. Then let's maybe add one more question before we do a quick feedback round from our panelists. And I'll take here the question of, no, I think we're fine right now. If there are any additional questions that I didn't include, feel free to put them back on the chat box. I mean, with these reflections and questions, I'm going to give back the floor to Jeffrey, Philip, and Jonathan. Jeffrey, would you like to react on some of the questions that were posed or on comments that your co-panelists have issued?
Yeah, I defer to Philippe and Jonathan to start off. I'm still preparing.
Oh, Jeffrey, we don't hear you right now. Are you out there? Jeffrey?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yep.
Okay, I defer to Philippe and Jonathan to start off with. I'm still compiling my responses.
Good. Okay, Philippe, can you interact?
Yeah, maybe I'll start off with the question referring to companies not having any physical presence anymore in specific countries, but are that are distributing their goods and services. This has changed fairly recently. As a matter of fact, the developmental path, such as China has put forward in the last 25 to 30 years, may be over in the future if advanced manufacturing continues in the way it does at the moment with enhanced automation technology that could provide a reshoring of manufacturing closer to the original, to the country of origin. For instance, whereas the iPhone may be produced to a large extent when it comes to physical technology in China, design, marketing, everything else is concentrated in the Silicon Valley. And this could also further increase if the manufacturing costs are to be decreasing through the use of automation technologies. And this is also relates also to what Jonathan has said. This could cut off the development path for a large swath of young for a young workforce in developing countries. And I think when it comes to taxation of the profits, this is only reachable through global accords or global regulation. I think loopholes, if there is none, and you can see it in the European Union how difficult it is to exert pressure on Ireland to change its taxation regime when it comes to American software giants. These agreements can only be reached on a global stage to prevent this disbalance.
Okay, thanks a lot, Philip, on the two of the questions that were mentioned. Jonathan, would you have any reactions on your co-panelists or on some of the questions that were raised by our participants?
Yeah, sure. So I think there was a question there, about the impact of leapfrogging technologies and how they can be quite transformative in different areas. And I think that is certainly true. That we don't, in emerging contexts or developing contexts, we don't necessarily have to go through the same change processes that have been experienced in existing sort of OECD developed countries. We can go from having very little to sort of straight into the higher end or more modern versions of those technologies, which is fantastic in many cases. But one of the key things I guess I didn't quite pick up on there was who has the knowledge about those technologies, who has the skills to operate them, who has the skills to maintain them, who is even aware of their existence in these different contexts. And that was something that in the research we did with WeGo and the Rockefeller Foundation, we found fundamentally lacking among most people, that people simply weren't aware of these technologies. To us, we read about them every day online or in the newspapers or with our colleagues and our friends, but we have to remember that the vast majority of those 3.5 billion informal workers around the world don't know about these technologies. So how can they harness them if they're not even aware of their existence, let alone the impacts they may have on their lives? I think there was a question from Melba about the impacts of changes in disruptive technologies and emerging technologies from the USA and Germany into emerging economies. And there have been a number of both positive and negative examples. What we've seen a huge amount of is that, particularly in the UK and I think elsewhere as well, call centres for whether it be a bank or your own energy supplier or whoever else, any company, call centres are often based out in India with educated young people in India working at those call centres to answer and deal with your problems. But with the advent of artificial intelligence and, adaptations of things like we see with Alexa and Siri, where robots essentially can answer your questions and deal with your inquiries, we're seeing thousands upon thousands of jobs being shared in the Indian call centres every single week. So that is one significant disruption that we're seeing from that type of technology being exported around the world. One of the more positive aspects actually is in distributed manufacturing, the ability to manufacture things on a smaller scale but still at a relatively low price point, to manufacture things on demand, particularly with the advent of things like 3D printing as well. We're seeing that actually sparking off entirely new economies in places like Peru and South Africa and India as well. So while we're seeing significant changes in one area from these types of technologies from the US and Germany, and the impacts on their economies and how that's then transferring across, there are positives and negatives. In terms of, there was a question about, that I saw on the chat list there, about sort of fully digital companies that don't necessarily have a physical presence, that operate globally through digital means across the world, and issues around taxation and where that tax is paid and how much it should be and where it should come from. I'm not best placed to answer that necessarily, but what we have seen is the impacts that can create in changes in work opportunities and the types of work and the security of that work. One of my great friends, Abigail Hunt, who works for a research organisation called ODI, the Overseas Development Institute, has done some pioneering research on how platforms that we see like Uber, like Deliveroo, and these other and TaskRabbit and other types of gig economy technology platforms that are based upon mobile platforms are now changing work opportunities in emerging economies like Brazil, South Africa, and India, and opening up new opportunities for people, and opening up as well things like access to formal banking. We've got to remember that the vast majority of the world, more than 3/4 of the world, don't have a bank account. So when we talk about digital payments, the advent of digital payments is becoming truly transformative. So when that's combined with digital work platforms as well, to seek work in areas that it can be often very difficult to find work, that's becoming extremely positively disruptive in those places. Now, the work that Abby has done, and I will share a link to that in a moment, has also highlighted, though, the inequalities that are, again, being mirrored and potentially exacerbated through that type of work, particularly about the dignity and decency of that work for women, and particularly in the domestic care sectors. We are seeing that those types of platforms, because of the lack of regulation, because of the lack of local physical presence, people are undertaking sort of exploitative measures of those workers. And that comes back again to that notion I mentioned before about the importance of organising. In the UK, we have a food delivery service called Deliveroo, where people basically cycle from one store to your house with your food from places that wouldn't normally sort of do takeaway deliveries. And they were being exploited in terms of their pay and not being treated as workers and so on. Because they were able to create WhatsApp groups and can communicate together, they were then able to collectively bargain for better working rights. So if we can see that type of digital technology also helping those workers to adapt and to collectively bargain for better rights, then I think that we have quite a positive trajectory on our hands for that as well.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jonathan, for these additional reflections. I'll hand over for final feedback to Jeffrey right now.
Yeah, I would just echo the comments that were made by Philippe and Jonathan, and I would say that I think that the jury is out on how these new technologies, especially something that's emerging like artificial intelligence, is going to affect emerging economies. And I think that one of the reasons that Philippe and I have focused on Germany and the United States is that in a lot of ways, because of the high cost of labor, they actually have the most to lose from the introduction of technology and automation. And I think that, you know, we're used to seeing political consequences emanating from emerging markets that are dealing with political and social instability that's caused by, you know, economic instability, people not being able to find jobs and provide for their families. And I think that what's interesting about Germany and the United States is, and Europe more generally, is the political and social ramifications that are going to come from the introduction of technology and automation and its effect on labor. And so I guess I'll close with that.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jeffrey.
Can I just add one more thing? Sorry, I think
yes, for sure.
Just a reflection on something that both Jeffrey and Philippe have said before about this, this bipolarization of work in terms of higher skilled, higher income, and lower skilled, lower income, and less secure work. What I think we've not covered necessarily is the age dimension in this as well, and also that this being potentially more negative for the developed economies and more positive for emerging economies. The reason being that we are seeing and will experience in the coming years, as predicted, a youth bulge, particularly in Africa, where the majority of the population in the continent of Africa will be considered youth, as in under 35 and of working age. So while that presents an enormous challenge in terms of the work opportunities that need to be available for that huge growing number of working age people, they are also at an age where they are able to adapt, to learn new skills, to undertake new education courses, to undertake a bit more risk if they don't yet have the same responsibilities as those that are a little older. So there is a slightly rosier picture there when we compare it to the slightly older and more aging populations in the developed world. And I think, my own mum is quite a good example of that. She was a retail worker, and her job is now at threat of redundancy from automation of the checkout tills in the supermarket where she works. They're transforming all but 3 of the cashiers in the supermarket into automated machines. So she herself is at threat, and as someone that is 60 years old, it's extremely difficult for her now at that age to find employment and to find opportunities for changing her type of employment and gaining new skills to find new work. So there are not just the type of work, but also we have an age dynamic that's coming to play here as well that we need to take note of.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jonathan, for adding additional complexity to the conversation. I'm going to just add 2 quotes because we're about to finish the webinar that I think add some additional, let's say, perspective to it. It was Melba that said, like, I was wondering if this whole exchange on the future of work can likewise be directed towards addressing the basic forms of inequalities, and how can we as a global community seek to address these imposing problem on inequalities, including lack of access to basic necessities. And then Christian Vivas that says, I don't think there's a lot of injustice in technology. Its aim is to maintain equity in the population, even in the equalities it's in, either by the level of access according to their economic level, geographical location, or thought. Its objective, in my opinion, is to maintain a balance in a vast world without borders that today touches work as the only capable of giving sustainability to man. Then, how to make it more versatile and in full harmony with the environment, that's the goal. So 2 additional reflections on that. We will continue the conversation in our massive online open course. We will also post the registration of this webinar for people who would like to review or for people who didn't have the opportunity to participate right now. So the conversation will be accessible. I would like to thank very much Jonathan Casey, Philippe Lawrence, and Jeffrey Brown for their interesting and inspiring contributions. It's food for more thought, and said the conversation had a good kickstart here. Thanks a lot, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
From Berlin. Bye-bye.